Okay, disclaimer. As you well know, I happen to be a conservative Republican. I like the current president. I really didn't like the previous president, President Obama. I liked both Presidents Bush. I didn't like Clinton very much. I really loved Ronald Reagan. He's my favorite president of all time. I'm telling you this to remind you that my point of view is not the truth. My point of view is simply a point of view. And I'm going to try to be fair as I explain this as a structural problem, even though it's the sort of thing that today various conservatives have had problems with. Hillary Clinton was the wife of President Bill Clinton back in the 90s. She was also a senior partner at the Rose Law Firm, which is a prominent law firm within the state of Arkansas where they lived. Hillary Clinton became a senator from the state of New York after President Clinton left office in 2001. And she was prominent in the U.S. Senate because she was the former First Lady and very well known. In 2008, she ran for the Democratic nomination to be president and lost to Barack Obama. When Barack Obama became president in 2009, he appointed Mrs. Clinton Secretary of State, which is our leading foreign policy official, our chief diplomat. Secretary of State Clinton chose to have an email server in her home on her property, where she conducted business as Secretary of State. This is against federal regulations. It is against the interests of the United States in that a system like that is much more easily hacked by foreign spies and agents than a system built and set up within the federal mainframes and the federal computer system, within the sort of cordoned off area that deals with high-level, top-secret government stuff. When she was called on this, she claimed that this was personal emails about yoga appointments and letters about grandchildren. And when her computer servers were subpoenaed by a court to be investigated, there was major crashing involved, and they just weren't filled with any data anymore. And it later turned out she admitted to using a computer program called BleachBit, which is supposed to wipe data systems clean. These are all things that violate the federal regulations, and had any of her employees in the State Department done this, they probably would be in federal prison. In 2015 and 16, this became so prominent that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the National Investigative Force, along with the under the supervision, should I say, of the Department of Justice, began a series of investigations to the extent Hillary Clinton broke laws. During the presidential campaign of 2016, after Hillary Clinton was the presumptive Democrat nominee, the Attorney General, who's the leader of the Department of Justice, after having a private conversation with her husband, Bill Clinton, on an airplane, recused herself, which means she said, I'm not really going to get involved in this, because it seemed like there was an attempt to influence her by former President Clinton. It was an appearance of impropriety thing. We don't know for sure, it just looked bad. So the director of the FBI, James Comey, came out and had a fairly unprecedented press conference where he admitted that Secretary of State Clinton had violated federal regulations and had even broken the law. But his words were, no reasonable prosecutor would then prosecute her for this. In other words, the implication was that these were minor infractions not worthy of genuine investigation. In other words, the leader of the Federal Bureau of Investigations whitewashed or made clean this entire matter and said that it was now politically off limits because impartial, incorruptible federal bureaucrats, including himself, had looked it over and said no reasonable prosecutor would take action on the basis of this information. A lot of people had a problem with this because it seemed to be a political decision. And it was something which poisoned the election in 2016. A couple of weeks before Election Day, FBI Director Comey came out again and said new information had come out because of another senator's computer, and we have to open this investigation again. So suddenly it was political fair game again, this choice of Mrs. Clinton to have this private server. And then a couple of days later, Comey said, oh, no, everything's fine, nothing to see here, move along. So Director Comey, even though he was a bureaucrat, was involving himself pretty prominently in the American political system in the election of 2016 for president. President Trump chose to keep him when he became president as FBI director. But a few months later, it became clear that Mr. Comey was leaking information selectively to the media, which is not something he's supposed to do, and so President Trump fired him. The firing of James Comey brought about an investigation into the president, which brought everything that the president did under a legal cloud. For the next 2 years, the investigation was conducted, and the presumption was that there were crimes that needed to be investigated, and that firing Comey was President Trump's way of protecting himself. This is extremely political. And what it led to was questions of impeachment. Ultimately, that particular investigation, which was activated by James Comey's firing, did not lead to President Trump's impeachment. But it did place his administration under a legal strain and under a cloud for 2 years, and it was associated with other things that then led to President Trump's impeachment by the House of Representatives. Not his conviction, because he wasn't convicted by the Senate, but he was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives. Again and again, it seemed like Department of Justice officials were involved, particularly in the FBI structure directly under James Comey. There were 2 senior investigators named Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. And they had a series of emails with one another where they expressed their disdain for Trump supporters and their horror at the notion that Trump might become president. And Strzok assured Page that there was a failsafe in place to prevent this from going too far. Many people believe that Mr. Strzok meant the trap of firing James Comey, which would lead to federal investigations and impeachment, special prosecutors, and so forth. Now, were Strzok and Page political appointees? No, they were not. They were supposed to be civil service bureaucrats without a political agenda. I don't know, and it doesn't really matter what you think or I think of President Trump, of Secretary of State Clinton, of Secretary of State Clinton's willingness to violate the federal regulations on computer security and having a thing in her home about the use of BleachBit, about the firing of James Comey, or any of the other stuff that have been political footballs over the years. It doesn't matter whether you like or dislike Orange Man, and it doesn't matter whether or not you think that his impeachment should have led to his conviction and removal from office. On record, there are many within the Department of Justice who did not seem to act as impartial, unpolitical people. Rather, they seemed very, very interested in taking sides. If that served Republicans, I would be just as unhappy about it. At least I hope and believe I would be. I don't think that any time civil service bureaucrats who get involved in the political structure, I don't think that whenever that happens, it's a good thing. If a politician goes to battle with another politician, if Clinton runs again for president, or if Comey runs for office as an elected official, that's all fine. That's American politics. We argue, we battle donkeys versus elephants. But for bureaucrats who are supposed to be politically neutral to so frequently and so intensively and so consistently get involved in the political process is a matter of concern to me and to many Americans who do not want to see a bureaucracy that runs the country. We want a constitutional system where, to the extent bureaucracy exists, it serves the people by serving the elected officials that the people elect. So, right now, the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office, and senior levels at the Federal Bureau of Investigation are themselves under a political cloud because of these actions over the last 7 or 8 years. If you have thoughts on this, one way or the other, I'll certainly be interested in reading your comments. We'll move on next.